Alright, so welcome back. We're going to do a little bit more with optionals. We're going to learn a little bit about using views in a playground. We're also going to learn about something called optional chaining, and then we're also going to learn about something called optional binding. I think they all have these fancy terms which I can never remember. But we're going to start off with learning about views and optional chaining. So go ahead and open back up your project. You've probably still got it open. And what we're going to do is we are going to start doing some things with views. And if we're going to start doing things with views, then we're going to need UIKit. Now, I never like to put my imports in the middle of the program, so I'm actually going to move it to the top. So I deleted it earlier, and then I put it back here. And that's because we didn't need it until we actually start working with these views. So what I'd like to do with my views is I'd like to make a button to begin with. So the way you make a button is you say UI button. That's just the class name is UI button. There's a couple of different constructors. I'm going to use the constructor that uses a frame. So I'm going to pass in a frame. You'll notice that we're using a constructor here, so we have to actually name our variables. This is a frame. If you started typing this, it would code complete for you. There's a couple different ways to make frames, but they're core graphic rectangles. So we're going to say CG, which stands for core graphics, rect make, and it gets an X and a Y, and then a width and a height. So we're just making a button which is 100 by 100. And one neat thing you can do in Playgrounds is you can click on it and see what it looks like so far. It turns out that a button that's just a certain size, it doesn't look like much yet, so it's just kind of empty. If you wanted to actually make it look like something, you could do things like setting a title. So one way you could set a title is you could say button, which is B in this case, dot set title. I'm going to make the title be press me, and we're going to be setting this for the state UI control state normal. One kind of neat thing about this, and then if we click on it again, it'll say press me, in white text with no background. One kind of neat thing is for state knows it's going to receive some UI control state value, and if you would like to, you can use shorthand. You can actually just say dot normal, and that's a totally valid thing to do. If we wanted to keep adding things, we can go ahead and set the background color. So here I typed in set background color to the color red. And this is the first time that the eyeball actually makes something that's useful, right? So I wanted to kind of tell you about how you can use views in Playground because that's important. But what I also wanted to talk about is something called optional chaining. Because what's going to happen is you're going to use objects in UIKit that have all these optionals on them, and you're going to have to know how to work with them. So for example, let's say you wanted to get the text from the button. So what you can do is you can grab the title label, but you can see the title label is actually an optional title label because it might have a label or it might not have a label. And so the label is one piece, and then what I want to grab on it is the text. And there might be text or there might not be text. And you'll notice that if I just say .text, the compiler is actually really good about helping me out. It actually just typed this question mark for me. So what is this question mark? What did it do here? I know it has to do with optionals because it's a question mark. What it really did is it rewrote like if b.title label, and so if it exists, then use it, right? But what it did is it did it in one line kind of smoothly for me. So question mark says, hey, if it exists, give me the text on it. And the text is also an optional. And so you can see that on the side it shows up as some press me. So it's showing that it's a string, but it's an optional string. So one way you can do it is with this optional chaining, and I do recommend using optional chaining quite a bit when you're writing your code. And that what it does is if it exists, it uses it, and if it doesn't exist, it just silently does nothing, which is kind of nice. Another option you could go is if you know that something exists, you could use what we did last time, and that's forced unwrapping, so that's exclamation point. And so I know that this title label exists, and then I know that there's text on it, right? And on the side, you can see that right now it's saying some press me because the text is an optional. If I wanted to say, hey, I know there's text on it as well, I could put an exclamation point on the label, and I could put an exclamation point on the text, and now it just says press me. Again, note that by putting exclamations on here, you're promising that this thing exists. So if I was to go back and comment out this line, you can see that there's a problem, right? It threw the error in the wrong spot. But the moral of the story is that there's an error. So you can see that if I comment this out, that fixed the problem despite the error being thrown up there. And this one was fine because it used optional chaining and it just kind of silently gave you nil, no big deal. But this one used those exclamation points, which puts the responsibility on the developer. And if it doesn't exist, you get a runtime error. Now, I've said that a couple times of like, oh, it's a runtime error, that's terrible. But to be honest, you will use exclamation points all the time in your code as well. Go ahead and use them, and just know that if you're wrong, it's going to crash. But that's okay, because you should make code that works right. So that's optional chaining. Let's go ahead and talk about one other way you can kind of like safely use optionals, and that's something called optional binding. I think it's easier just to see an example. So here I'm just going to bring in this giant example. And what this is it happens all the time where you want to see if something exists, and then if it does exist, you want to use a variable for it. For years, I've been doing this thing where I grab it as a variable, and then I do an if statement on it, then I use it. And Swift has combined kind of the grabbing it into the if statement. So the syntax looks kind of weird at first. It says if let, and you're like, whoa, that is crazy. But really all it is it's got a 10.toInt, which is an optional. If that optional exists, assign its value into value if non-null. And you can see that it works fine. And so it prints out the value right here. So you can actually use this variable in your code. And if you wanted to, you could print it on a line by itself. Notice that even though toInt returned an optional, using this syntax gave you a required int. And this is also totally safe, right? So here I do it with Dave, which will give me nil back. And you can see that all it does is it just runs your false clause, right? So in your false clause, if you tried to use that variable, it would be bad, right? So that variable doesn't exist in the false clause. That variable only exists in the true clause, which turns out not to run in this case. So that's another way. It's called optional binding. It uses this let inside the if statement that you can safely unwrap an optional. And to be honest, it turns out to be quite valuable. All right, so that's kind of the breakdown of optionals. You kind of understand the basics of how they work, which is a very easy concept. And then you see like some of the slight complexities that come up. Probably the most useful thing in this lecture is actually the optional chaining. You're going to see it all the time. But this optional binding thing, it ends up being handy as well. All right, so that's kind of different for Swift. Regardless of what other languages you know, this lecture was probably pretty new for you, but that's what you need to know about optionals. All right, see you next time.